multifunction window is where you'll find some helpful tabs like questions and answers, an area to download any available materials, and speaker bios. You can also turn on closed captioning by clicking the CC button in the lower right-hand corner of the video player. KPMG has been approved by NASBA to deliver CPE-worthy training. Today's CPE will be tracking your participation through attendee checkpoints, which will look like this. In addition to attending the entire session, you must confirm your participation by clicking Confirm each time this message pops up. Your participation will be tracked, and failure to actively participate will result in denial of CPE credits. If you have any technical issues during the webcast, please submit a question through the Questions and Answer panel, and our producers will respond to you directly. Please submit all content questions through the Questions and Answers panel as well. Thank you, and enjoy the webcast.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm Claudia Allen, a Senior Advisor with KPMG's Board Leadership Center, and this is our annual On the Board Agenda webcast where we examine the issues that are at the forefront of boardroom debates. I'm delighted to be joined today by my colleagues Susan Angeli, Stephen Brown, and Annalisa Barrett. As we all know, there really are no shortage of issues that are confronting boards, and many of them underscore the need for agility and resilience in the boardroom. To help organize our discussion today, we're going to focus on 4 themes. First, the impact of volatility and uncertainty. In other words, the convergence of factors like wars in the Middle East, stresses on supply chains, uncertainty about interest rates, the fall of many foreign governments, a new administration in the U.S. Second, the impact of technology disruption on companies, their business models, their strategies, their employees. In other words, from the board's perspective, how do we help management take advantage of the new technology while making sure that risks are being are being managed and mitigated? Third, the pushback against ESG, which includes diversity, equity, and inclusion. This poses difficult issues for many companies. If these issues are central to the mission of the company or its strategy, it may also pose difficult issues in terms of recruitment and retention of employees. And lastly, board skills and composition. Board composition, another area where the pushback against DEI is having an impact. And then in terms of skills, the debate about which skills you need in the boardroom. Simply not enough real estate around the table to have individuals with experience in all the major issues that a company is addressing. So we want to address your questions today. Please feel free to submit them during the program. We'll try to get to them. We will address many of the questions that were submitted in advance of the program. And we are going to take time to discuss your responses to the questions we posed during the registration process. And we heard from approximately 1,300 directors, so I think those questions are worth examining. So let's move to our discussion of the compound risk volatility of the environment, sort of the perma-crisis that many boards feel that they are facing. So Susan, the geopolitical landscape continues to be very volatile. We've talked about wars, imposition of tariffs, and interestingly, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations recently said that this is the most complex international environment in 80 years. So how should boards be thinking about geopolitical risks and uncertainty?
Yeah, thanks for that, Claudia. And it's great to be here with everyone. So it's a wonderful time to be a board member. It is interesting. It is exciting. Geopolitical uncertainty absolutely has to be high on management's risk management list. Tariffs are a big point of interest for most companies these days. Right now, boards really need to look at how management is monitoring and engaging on the issues we know about, but also assessing their process for early warnings if a new issue arises or a known issue becomes worse or accelerates in an unforeseen way. I heard what you said about the Council for Foreign Relations, Congresswoman's comment, Claudia, and that's really well taken. If we think about it, over half the world's population held elections in 2024. And given the levels of change and polarization that we're seeing worldwide, we'd really be remiss if, as board members, we allow management to just focus on the challenges we already know about. And board members themselves need to stay educated, getting briefings, looking at trends, hearing from management, but also hearing from outside experts. And they really should be digging in to understand management's readiness, not only about monitoring, but how is management going to be ready to act as circumstances change, whether it's scenario planning, crisis readiness, what have you.
Yeah, I think, the point about trends is really important because you don't want to just focus on the latest development. But can you dig a little bit more deeply on scenario planning? Because that can really be a very useful tool.
Yeah, absolutely. So scenario planning should focus deeply on value chain readiness and adaptability. For one thing, management should really be mapping locations for all key suppliers and markets and planning alternative options. Even for those areas that currently seem stable, because we've seen how quickly things can change, scenario planning should be looking really at every key location. As I mentioned, looking at the impact of potential tariffs is critically important. Looking at planning with respect to our relationship with China is incredibly important. But then also, plan more broadly. Whatever the event is, whether it's a tariff, an extreme weather-related event, a change in the regulatory requirements, or what have you, management should be asking the question, and boards should be asking the question of management, what will our company do if something arises that affects an individual location that's important to our value chain? And what if multiple locations are impacted at the same time? Do we have sufficient resilience built in to weather whatever comes? And crisis management is also an important part of this. Sound crisis management requires planning. It requires knowing who the people are going to be, working to develop an alignment on what the company's priorities are going to be in managing a crisis, and also practicing. And a lot of these things are things that can be done before a crisis hits. So understanding from the board perspective who's involved, what their goals are, how they work together as a team, sitting in on practice sessions, understanding how much they're practicing and what the level of readiness is, and then also really getting into a question about values. And that's going to influence how tough decisions are going to be made by companies. So the board really needs to stay very close to all of these going forward.
Well, thank you, Susan. When we were doing the prep for this call, you had asked me a bit about the impact of the election on regulation. And that's a subject that we could spend the entire hour on. We know that one of the key themes of the current administration is deregulation, and that's also combined with some uncertainty. So, we are seeing a push for deregulation, particularly in areas like finance, crypto, the environment, fossil fuels. As to antitrust, I think we're expecting less aggressive enforcement in the M&A arena than under former Chairman Khan. At the same time, the president, before he took office, had indicated that the administration might go after big tech and censorship in a vigorous but not stifling way. AI, the administration has signaled a light touch. We have the Department of Government Efficiency with Elon Musk. We don't know what legal powers it will have or funding. And then we have a very large number of executive orders, and we're seeing some companies form war rooms just to get through them all, analyze them, and understand their impact. I mean, this is a huge regulatory wave. Many are or will be challenged. And some of them seem to be challenging the economics of certain industries, like industries related to climate transition. And that will pose some difficult questions for companies in those industries about making long-term investments following a big regulatory shift. And then we're seeing some of the states step up to fill the void, or what they perceive to be a void, in areas like AI and the environment. As a practical matter, that means companies will have to deal with a patchwork of regulation. Enforcement activity, I think we're expecting some less in some of the areas I've talked about, but immigration is high on the enforcement agenda, and that means, certain industries may be affected quite strongly. Hospitality and leisure, construction, healthcare, agriculture. And then I think it's also important to remember that in the mix, we have a trend that's continued over time of the courts restricting the power of regulatory agencies. So, for example, over the summer, we had a large decision which now says that regulatory agencies no longer can issue reasonable interpretations of ambiguous laws. In other words, it's either Congress makes the statute clear or the court decides. And I think what this means is new rulemaking will take longer. The agencies will want to be sure that they have delegated authority, and we're likely to see even more legal challenges of existing laws and new laws.
So in all of this, Claudia, what do you think are some of the related risks that companies should be focusing on?
Yeah, the president has a pro-growth agenda. At the same time, some are concerned that tax cuts, the president has signaled he wants to keep in place the tax cuts that are expiring this year. He's interested in additional tax cuts. And there's some concerns that the resulting deficits, combined with tight immigration and tariffs, could lead to sticky inflation and higher for longer interest rates. And part of the unknown is, how high tariffs will be, whether there'll be retaliation from other countries, and how swiftly they are enforced. So, I think it's worth stopping to look at one of the first questions we asked the audience in registration. We said, to what extent has your company adjusted its strategy to accommodate announced and expected policy responses from the new administration? 6% said significant adjustments, 39 a moderate change, so 45% moderate or significant, and then a notable 43% cited no change. And that's an interesting number, and I think one of the questions is, are companies taking a wait and see attitude? So let me bring you in, Stephen. When we talk about change, M&A and activism are inevitable parts of the equation. I think, there are a lot of lawyers whose phones are ringing off the hook who do M&A work because of, the feeling that less regulation and lower taxes will be conducive to M&A. And, last year we saw a record number of activists and a record number of CEOs shown the door after activists appeared. So can you talk to us about shareholder sentiment and what you see in terms of M&A and activism in the coming year?
Sure. First of all, it's always great to be with my colleagues, and I thank the folks who have joined us live on the webinar. I appreciate that they've come to us. Now, for the M&A environment and the activism environment, and it should be no secret that deal making will likely be up going forward. And that's because if we think about the past decade and a half, the activism itself has had a hockey stick trajectory of growth and success, and the investing model shows no signs that it's going to be halted. Plus, activists have grown in number. They are very good at what they do. And they start to champion issues in which have a collective interest with institutional shareholders, which is, by the way, how you win. They can't win without the voters, the people who have the votes, which are institutional investors going after them. So that degree of angle of how quick it goes depends on a lot supply of activists, where they're up because they've been so successful in the past decade. They're people, we call them sons of activists, daughters of activists. They're mainly sons who have left and formed their own outfits. The cost of money might go down. All that, the regulatory environment, which we think, as you talked about, might be relaxed, particularly towards M&A and antitrust. Corporate defenses, the last 20 years, have been eroded. Shareholder sentiment is an interesting thing to talk about because I think that's going to be the difference in whether activists win or lose. But I think we're going to see deal making up, M&A up, activism up. What might be different is the type of activist that you see. If we think now, if you're old enough, like, and I can say everyone on the screen as contemporaries. Now we remember the 80s and the 90s and the brashness of we didn't call them activists, we called them corporate raiders. Those folks have gone away, they've retired, they've passed on, and so you might see this new word of constructivists. At the end of the day, they're still activists and they still want board seats short of control. So we might see a different type of activist, but we're going to see it.
And Stephen, thoughts on anything new that companies should be doing, to proactively consider the what happens if an activist appears?
Sure. Well, first of all, I should say, in terms of the shareholder sentiment of the institutional investors, like I said, you can have an activist, but you got to look at your institutional investors. And the interesting thing is that if we think about the last couple of years, really the rhetoric has been very political. It's been about negative screening and ESG, and what it did push out, that rhetoric pushed out what we saw 5 years ago was this intense focus on short-termism. And that focus was meant to sort of defeat the activists who were thought to be very short-term, so telling long-term institutional investors, don't go with the activists, they're short-term, short-term, short-term. You haven't had that discussion. And I think what you will see is institutional investors who, again, want change, if they believe in the theory of change, if they believe that the stock price has been down, there's no question that they will side with the activists, whether or not it's a short-term play. And so that's a very interesting thing that's happening in terms of the focus you see from institutional investors. That said, boards need to ask management, do we have an activist playbook? What is it? Let's see it. Let's talk through it. Tell me about your shareholder engagement. What do they think about us? When I say us, I mean the board, because IR, investor relations, are very good in telling you how people, portfolio managers, think about the company. I'm not saying that. That's important to know. I'm saying board members ask, what do they think about us, me, director? Because it gets really personal when an activist goes after, they don't go after a board seat, they go after people. And lastly, board composition, which is thinking very deeply about, do you have the right people in place and how would you respond when they attack a board member?
Thanks, Stephen. Let's move on to technological disruption. Last year we saw Gen AI continue to take flight. Many companies, or at least a number, moved from piloting Gen AI projects to larger scale rollout. Some have begun to recognize revenue. There's speculation that Gen AI could lead to new winners and losers in certain industries within a couple of years. And we know that Gen AI is not the end of the technological disruption that companies will have to face. For example, quantum computing is on the horizon. So Annalisa, how can boards get the education they need to understand these new technologies? Because you can't oversee something that you don't understand.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Claudia. And I'll also add my gratitude to each of you and to everyone joining us today. For any issue that the board oversees, the directors don't need to be an expert in each of these new technologies as they come out, depending on the industry, but they do need to understand it sufficiently to understand how it might impact the company and their peers, the risks that the new technology may pose to their company, and what opportunities it might present. So they also need to think about the ways, the use cases for the new technology and what impact that might have on the existing workforce, anxieties it may produce in, thinking about whether or not the new technology may replace certain jobs, and thinking about potential needs for new employees and what that might look like. So in order to stay on top of these emerging technologies as they come out and the impacts that they might have on the company, directors can use the same intellectual curiosity that that directors use in most aspects of their board work, and specifically, there are no shortage of formal training opportunities to become conversant and have a good understanding of the basics of the new technologies that are coming out, whether that's currently Gen AI. And coming technologies as well, as you mentioned, and those trainings can be pursued individually or as a full board. Both having internal people understand, people working on the implementation of the new technologies at the company come to speak to the full board, and I do think it's very important for the full board to be, in tune with and understand who at the company is overseeing the implementation of new technology, and have presentations from the IT and technical experts at the company to really have that relationship with them to know and to feel comfortable with their expertise and their plans going forward. And also external. Go ahead.
Yeah. Annalisa, I was going to say, the National Association of Corporate Directors, the Blue Ribbon Commission report this year was on technology in the boardroom. I had the pleasure of serving on that commission. And I think there's a very strong message in that report about the need for the full board to level up its understanding of tech and to recognize that since tech is changing so quickly, that education really needs to be ongoing. And it's not something where you can assume, just some of your fellow directors have knowledge. The goal really is for there to be a basic level of fluency on technologies that are relevant to the company among all the directors.
Right, definitely. And I think that, one of the recommendations in that report that I think is important to highlight is to have the board discuss and develop a common understanding among each of the board members about what that proficiency should look like, and to the extent to which each director is at that level of proficiency that the board has determined is appropriate for their board and their company and the industry, and to develop a plan for those directors who are not at that level of proficiency, and also prospectively, what is the plan for maintaining, and seeing around the corner for the new technologies that are coming out. So I think, external experts coming in, we often recommend having a futurist come in. Not all futurists are focused only on technology. So thinking about technology in that broader context of scenarios that may play out, especially in the context of the uncertainty that you discussed at the beginning with Susan. So as from a governance perspective, as the board is thinking about the level of proficiency and where technology oversight should be housed within the board, what are you seeing as boards think about how to structure that oversight of new technologies, and specifically Gen AI right now? I know we're getting a lot of questions about which committee should oversee these technology risks. So what are you seeing in that regard?
Yeah, thanks for that, Annalisa. I mean, I think the starting point is not which committee. I think the starting point really is the full board needs to come to terms and debate the impact of technology on the business model, the strategy, the workforce. Those really are full board issues. And, some issues are and should be delegated down to committees where there's, greater capacity to do heavy lifting. But I think it's important not to lose sight of the need for the full board to oversee. And I think ultimately we'll see every committee of the board have some level of responsibility for oversight of Gen AI and future technologies. A lot of issues seem to fit somewhat naturally within the scope of what the audit committee is supposed to do. So, for example, an audit committee should be asking, the finance department, are you using Gen AI to prepare financial statements or to prepare regulatory filings? How have our internal controls been updated to reflect new tech, and what should be a related data governance program? Audit often oversees compliance with law, and we know that there is no shortage of laws and regulations being enacted relating to Gen AI. So this is an area that really does require monitoring because it can affect how and where a company can use Gen AI or other technologies. ERM, typically, the audit committees oversees all or part of it. Has it been updated to take into account the new technology, data? Cyber and data privacy, we see that a lot delegated to the audit committee, and if so, you would then need to also oversee the aspects relating to these new technologies. So I think that's just for starters, and I think what that also emphasizes is the need to look at whether the audit committee has the bandwidth and the skill set to oversee all of these issues. I think nominating and governance will likely be looking at issues like what skills you need on the board, board training, compensation would look at impact on the workforce, for example. And then there's the question as to whether you should have a technology and innovation type committee. About 14% of the S&P 500 have them. They're more common at companies that are in tech or companies that are undergoing a major technological transformation. But you need to think carefully about whether a new committee will work. I mean, do you have the directors who can serve on the committee? And what exactly will the committee do? So, Annalisa, let me move to a question that we got from the audience here, which is, let me see here. How do a board's oversight functions become more dynamic and adaptable, moving away from the traditional, now redundant approach? And I think there I would say, it's the same basic issue of, are your board committees fit for purpose? It's worth looking at the overall allocation of issues to board committees. Do they still make sense? Is a new committee something that you want to do? Should you form a subcommittee, an ad hoc committee? Do you get more outside experts? Do you form an advisory board? Mm-hmm. So, let me turn it back to you, Annalisa.
Right. Yeah. Well, I wanted to follow up on something that you mentioned regarding data and data governance. And so can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of board oversight of data and how that's feeding into these new technologies?
Yeah, data governance is not a new subject, but the rise of Gen AI has really, pushed it to the front because quality data is the lifeblood of Gen AI. And the goal is for a company's management to have a program that ensures the integrity, reliability, quality of the data that the company uses. And from a board perspective, the board should be overseeing what management is doing. In other words, understanding the risks that the data program poses. Issues like privacy, violation of intellectual property rights, reputational damage if data is used in a way that's viewed as unethical. I think board wants to understand what the downsides are, how they're being mitigated, who's in charge of the program. Importantly, how will information flow up to the board and when? Because that's key for oversight. And does the data program support the company's strategy? So let me stop and just cite some data from one of our questions during registration. We asked, how confident are you in the board's ability to assess the adequacy of the company's data governance efforts, given increasingly sophisticated cyber threats and the emergence of Gen AI? 14% said very confident, 60% somewhat confident, so room for improvement, and 13% not at all confident, which I would say is the equivalent of an indication that action is really required. So, Susan, when we talk about these balancing risks and benefits, can you talk to us more about some of the risks associated with Gen AI that the board really needs to understand?
Yeah, absolutely. And Gen AI, as you've indicated, Gen AI has been around. Well, AI has been around for decades. It's really this explosion in the usage and the kind of complexity and the black box nature of Gen AI that's causing a lot of these issues. And I think everyone knows this now, but for those who don't, the way Gen AI works is it trains itself on data that is fed to it. So it might be everything on the internet, it might be some smaller subset. But it is training itself and then answering questions in a probabilistic way. So a couple of things to think about from a board perspective. First is the risk of bias. And that comes out in ways where what the Gen AI is doing is essentially perpetuating some biases that are existing in the world. We're all human in the way that we make decisions, but Gen AI may be amplifying some of what they're seeing. And so we have seen some significant incidents of that happening in terms of when Gen AI is asked to recommend certain groups for loans or for promotions. So to really understand and get in front of the biases is critical for the board to be asking about. Another thing is just wrong information. Gen AI loves to give an answer, and it's not always the right one. I've heard the term confabulation. I've heard the term hallucination. There's all kinds of ways of describing it, but basically, you can't always trust what you get from Gen AI. And if the company is using Gen AI in a way that it's acting on that information without checking and double checking, that can certainly be an issue. Cybersecurity is another area. Gen AI makes it easier. I've heard of, we know about SaaS, software as a service. I've heard someone mention there's a thriving and growing industry in ransomware as a service. So it is becoming bigger and bigger issues because of the proliferation of Gen AI. Data privacy is another issue, and I'll put in there intellectual property issues as well in terms of inappropriate use of data that should not be in the public domain, is owned by someone, but is nevertheless used for training AI. And so those are issues to be concerned about as well. And just the whole lack of transparency, this whole black box about how generative AI makes decisions. And a question comes up about, well, who's accountable? What's accountable? Can an AI program be sued? Or is there someone in management that is on the line to make sure it's accurate? And so what we talk about sometimes is human-centric use of Gen AI. And then the last risk that I'm going to mention is the pure business risk. Gen AI is moving very quickly. It's moving in a way that tech often does, in that it's iterative. So it's getting better as it goes along, but there still are the problems that I mentioned with it. So companies need to find that right line for them of, there's a risk of moving too fast, but there's also a risk of moving too slowly and getting left behind competitively.
Yeah, I think some people think the biggest risk is not doing anything. In terms of risk, can you talk to us a little bit about misinformation and disinformation?
Wow, that could be an hour in and of itself. Yeah, there's kind of two pieces here. Again, whether it is because of generative AI, whether it's some actor putting something up that's misinformation, or disinformation, intentionally putting inaccurate information out there. And then it fails to get caught because whatever platform it's on is not stopping it. There is just a plethora, and again, companies really need to understand, how do we know what's accurate, what's not accurate? How do we know that our workforce is relying on verifiable information? So to really put that out there, and from the companies that are serving as platforms for information, every company has its own set of values, its own strategies, and its own risk profiles, and they will make their decisions based on that. As to the companies that are using this information, and sometimes it can be erroneous information that could significantly affect the company, either as a hit to the stock price or even more significantly in the long term in terms of a hit on its reputation. Companies have always had plans in place to prevent fraud and to respond to a communications crisis. That ratcheted up in the world of social media. It still has to ratchet up yet again in the world of generative AI because of just the plethora and the speed with which these things can proliferate.
Well, thanks, Susan. I mean, Stephen, when we talk about tech, I mean, people focus on the technology itself, but the people part of the equation is really vital because it changes the way people work. So, I mean, you need people with the skills to run the program, and then you need employees who have the incentive to use the tech. So what should the board be asking about the skills of management as to tech and employee training?
Well, if you don't mind, if I could sort of think about this in two separate ways. What the board should talk to the board, do for itself, and then what the board should ask management. And that first part, and all of us have, over the last year or so, have spoken with boards, been in boardrooms, and if I had to give a collective grade to the board and their ability to sort of get up to speed with AI, and I'm a college professor, a law professor, and I'm a very weak. I'm so generous when I give a grade, and so just so understand that. And maybe you guys can say, what would you give a grade? I'm being generous and giving them a collective B, if not a B minus. And don't write in, folks, about I'm an A, because then I'm not talking about you. But I really am. I think collectively it's been tough for boards to sort of get up to speed. One is just a rejection of something they're just not familiar. And it is technical. There's a lot being thrown at you. But the board really needs to understand the deep basics and be able to ask those questions of management that make sense, which includes, are we going to be responsible for reskilling? And that response maybe a decade ago or 5 years ago may then go to the talent overseas, sort of outsource overseas, which may not be the response in 2025 going forward, considering this administration has said that, and how they think about going overseas and outsourcing may not be the case. So we got to think about, are we have to reskill? And when management comes to a board and says, hey, we're doing X, Y, Z on AI, and we're going to gain efficiency because they're coming to the board to get a capital allocation, and they say, well, they won't affect our headcount. I hear it because I'm sitting in the boardroom. I hear that, and I just keep shaking my head silently. Like, how could that be? If you're going to get efficiency, you're going to do something to headcount, or you don't have efficiency. And so, I mean, those questions need to be asked. Are we going to be responsible for retraining, reskilling? Will we be able to access talent overseas? By the way, that is another reality today, which is, if you have talent overseas that would normally come on a visa to work for you, will they be allowed in? And will that work just remain overseas and remain contracted or outsourced if you can, because the talent is over there? And you already talked about sort of thinking about your internal auditors, your external auditors, and understanding how, if at all, they're using AI. And lastly, and this came up also about in a human resource context, what if any AI are we using? And human resource has been a place for the last 15 years, which has constantly gone through efficiency changes, right? And so, and we all know this, that essentially it hasn't been outsourced, but it's been insourced, meaning the employee now do it yourself benefits, do it yourself, fix your own thing, make sure you're doing all that stuff. Those things need to be looked at. And you already talked about sort of responsible AI and sort of thinking about that. But that's the job of the board. Again, we know that being on a board is still a darn good job because folks aren't leaving it, but it is a different era that we've walked into, and the need to get up to speed to understand what questions that should be asked.
Thanks, Stephen. I mean, let's move on to the pushback against ESG. I mean, we saw quite a bit of activity in that space in the last year, and the new administration has acted rather quickly to make its position very clear on ESG. And Elisa, let me start with you on DEI. You know, we've seen many companies take a step back from publicly promoting DEI, public campaigns, legal challenges, etc. And interestingly, we're seeing some companies include DEI as a risk factor in their SEC filings. At the same time, some companies are doubling down on their commitment to DEI. And most recently, the president signed an executive order directing the attorney general to identify companies with, quote, egregious and discriminatory, close quote, DEI programs. And that could indicate, potential investigations of public companies, large nonprofits, as well as litigation and regulatory action. And, we know that the law has not changed on, what is permissible, but that really is not the end of the inquiry. So how can companies navigate in this very complicated space?
In my view, it comes back to the fundamental, taking a look back at your mission and your values as a company. And often the board has the, viewpoint from that 30,000 foot level to help management kind of see the current tensions that that they're getting from, different sides of this issue in context. So if the board can help management really focus on where these changes that are being pushed for come within their mission and values, how they fit into their existing strategy for long-term value creation, then that can help guide some of the decisions that need to be made about, whether it's public statements on these issues or internal policies and practices that may be considered to be changed. So I think, the board has that unique ability to take that step back and think about it in the bigger picture. And as you mentioned, there's pressure, on both sides. We know that today's employees are looking for authenticity from their leaders and are willing to call out, inconsistencies in any statements that are made by leaders who a few years ago made commitments to diverse hiring and diversity programs internally and in the boardroom, and now maybe making different statements. So I think that understanding who your stakeholders are and how these issues will be received by them is an important piece of information to take into consideration as while making any of these decisions, whether or not to pull back from specific policies, where to allocate capital when it comes to programs within the company. And the other side is, go ahead. Please go ahead.
No, please continue.
Oh, I was just going to say the other, as we think about, the stakeholders, many investors are focused on encouraging companies to have diverse workforces, have diversity in the boardroom. And that's because they're focused on financial returns. And many studies have shown that diverse teams have better decision-making practices, have better outcomes when it comes to making decisions that impact financial performance. And so it is important to continue to focus on why the pressure is coming from different constituents, and think about how those constituents and different stakeholders will react when the kind of the pressure comes on to take a public stand. And we're seeing companies fall on both sides. We're also seeing that, and this was actually mentioned at Davos as well, that many companies internally are still focused on, some of the programs that may be considered a DEI program, employee resource groups and those types of things, but simply making them all inclusive, and therefore still meeting the needs of diverse groups within their workforce, but also avoiding the concerns related to exclusivity or preferential treatment. So I think it's a round take an overall view of the situation, measured responses.
So, Susan, I mean, climate falls within the ESG category that's experiencing a lot of pressure. The administration has made its views clear, but companies still need to navigate, and they have stakeholders beyond regulators. So, how can the board help management navigate here?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, as we've talked about as a group, oftentimes the discussion about climate immediately becomes a conversation about disclosure and regulation. And I'll get to that in a minute. That's important. But really, it's all about the impact on the business. And so really making sure as a board that management is assessing both the long-term, the short-term physical risk issues, reputational risk issues, understanding where the marketplace is going. We've talked before about the impacts that we're seeing today, extreme weather conditions, fires, et cetera. And companies are managing multiple disasters at the same time, rethinking their supply chains and even their business models. A lot of companies that depend on agricultural products for their manufacturing are very, very focused on where is this coming from, how is climate change going to affect it in the long term, and what are our alternative options. So that's one area that they should be looking at. Another, we've talked about for years about the transition, the energy transition, moving to cleaner energy. We know that the U.S. conversation has shifted sharply on that with the new administration. Whatever happens there, Europe still cares about this. Global companies are going to be having to manage the give and take of working in different parts of the world and different attitudes toward it. And that may affect, coming back to disclosure, that may affect regulation as well. Regulation as a global issue is not going away anytime soon. And so companies that are on top of it and are getting themselves set up and ready to comply with, new regulations are going to be well positioned.
So let's move on to our last topic, board composition and skills. We have seen the pushback against diversity extend to the boardroom. For example, NASDAQ had a comply or explain rule, which required disclosure in your proxy statement. That rule has been overturned, and it seems that NASDAQ won't appeal. There clearly are differing views on the benefits and potential risks of diversity. So, Susan, let me ask you, how have you seen boards effectively approach diversity?
Yeah, absolutely. So, sort of at its basic level, it's just about finding the best talent and looking beyond your immediate network to do that. And that's, kind of boards, I don't see them moving away from that. So, we've heard people say, well, you're going to reduce your standards. Frankly, with the countless board members I've spoken to over the years, I've never heard a single person say, my particular board has been damaged because of having diversity. But I have heard numerous anecdotes about the contrary. And as Annalisa pointed out, there is some research backing that as well. Look, we live in a diverse world. We know that diversity of thought, diversity of skill sets, diversity of experience adds value to the boardroom conversation. And with that comes personal characteristics. So that's just part of that whole diversity stew that really, sort of melds into a strong conversation. Like any board, diverse boards will benefit if there's the right set of skill sets around the board. There's relevant skill sets. The evaluations are robust, and board members that no longer have fresh skill sets roll off in favor of others that do have fresher skill sets. So those are, and that's definitely happening in all types of boardrooms. A board chair who ensures that all voices are heard, a culture of curiosity, constructive skepticism. All of those things are important in all boardrooms, and in particular where you do have diverse board voices in those boardrooms. And what Annalisa said about investors with respect to diversity in the workforce is also true with respect to diversity on the board. So investors are asking, they're engaging, and really digging into, so what is the composition of your board? Where are you finding top talent? Are you looking beyond your immediate network? And how are you bringing in insights that will help you understand your customer base, your employee base, and they do care about that deeply as a business issue for the most part.
Thank you, Susan. We recognize that there are differing views on diversity. So one of the questions we asked during registration was, if your board has increased its diversity over the past 2 to 3 years, what has been the impact on the quality of boardroom discussions? Almost half cited a significant or moderate improvement. 21% said no change, 2% cited a moderate decline, 0% a significant decline, and 17% said no change in diversity. So I think those are interesting findings given the relatively large size of the respondent pool. So Annalisa, let's pick up a related question, which is, board skills. Which ones do you need in the boardroom? Some people call it the question of rent versus buy. Do you have the skills around the table, or do you use outside advisors? And this often comes up. I know we have an audience question in the context of cyber and AI. Do you need an expert in those areas? So can you talk to us about that?
Yes, this does come up quite often, and as we talked about having technology expertise on the board or not, and other skill sets that are valuable in the boardroom discussions should you have someone with deep expertise. The answer is it depends, certainly, in my view. However, to the extent that any director is brought on because of deep expertise in an area, whether it's technology or human resources or supply chain, they should also bring a broad strategic experience and background. So each director has to be there to represent the investors and to be involved in all of the board's activities. And so, as Susan was describing the search process for director candidates, including people with deep expertise in areas where there may be skills gaps is important, but also ensuring that you're looking for people that, in addition to that skill set and deep expertise, have strategic experience running large organizations, P&L experience, those things that are fundamental to board service.
Stephen, let me ask you a question here. When we talk about board skills, one of the subjects that sometimes may not get enough airtime is the recency of director skills. So can you talk to us about that issue and, what the activist perspective is on that?
Well, very simply, from boards should think about what would shareholders want. And actually, and this is a job for IR, ask them, because they will tell you. And no one wants stale skills or a stale perspective. And so you need to really think about that. And again, I say activism because there have been plenty of studies of the last 5 years, every year, and it always comes out. that the majority, if not super majority of boards, of directors, when you ask them, is there someone on your board who shouldn't be there? They say there's at least one. And from an activist perspective, they'll say, there's probably 4 or 5. That's why I do what I do. And so always think about it. I'm not trying to scare any board members, but always thinking about, think like an activist and think about the issue around tenure and the freshness of skills.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think when we think about who activists target during a proxy fight, a lot of times it really is the longest tenured directors. Arguably that's because of concerns about skill sets. And I think there's also an issue about how you define, as we've been talking about, the necessary skills. For example, if you talk about needing a tech expert, which tech are you talking about? That is a huge series of issues. And, so how quickly will information become stale? I think it also ties into the question of whether you need a combination of sitting executives with very current knowledge and retired people. How quickly does knowledge become stale? So, I see that we are coming near the end of our time together. So I'm going to ask each of my colleagues for 1 or 2 practical takeaways for the audience. And Annalise, let me start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Claudia. We talked several times about, the uncertainty that companies are working in. And I mentioned that importance of going back to the company's mission and values as a way to frame any decisions that are being made in these uncertain times. So my recommendation is to ensure that everyone on the board and the management team has a consistent viewpoint on what the company's mission and values are. You may have new directors that have come on since that type of discussion has taken place in the boardroom. Strategic, planning may have led to a change in strategy that may require a revisitation of the, company's mission and values as things are changing so rapidly these days. So it may be worth time in the boardroom to revisit and ensure that everyone is committed to and bought into and excited about the mission and values of the company so that those can be seen as a framework for decision making in the boardroom.
Susan?
Yeah, so I'm going to build on what Annalisa said. And with everything that's going on, it's easy to get very distracted. And distracted in a way where, it's like a game of ping pong. Everything is just moving so quickly and you're not sure which way to look, and head gets turned in all kinds of different directions. And the role that the board can play anytime, but particularly now, is to help management filter out the noise and really focus on those critical aspects. Because when you're in the day-to-day world, it's very hard to do that. So the more that management can look to the board as a support, that the board has their back, that is going to be incredibly helpful to the company as a whole. And at the same time, of course, the board is going to want to hold management's feet to the fire to make sure that management will be ready when important changes are needed.
Thank you, Susan. Stephen?
3 quick things. 1, ESG is a Rorschach test. It elicits a response from someone, whoever you ask, and companies should try not to let that happen. And the way to do that is being intentional about your explanation of what you actually mean. And if you have clarity, particularly your employees, then it won't be that Rorschach test. And you shouldn't let politics sort of dictate, politics and regulation, your business strategy, unless it's compliance. Obviously, Drive 55 when it says Drive 55, but you got to run a business. And lastly, thinking about it from the investor standpoint, 3 Ps, which are different from what you may have learned in business school. Investors think about and evaluate companies on 3 Ps. Price, which they understand every day the stock market's open. People, they have full disclosure on who's doing what at the top leadership. And the last P, which is often not focused on by boards, which is process. They want to understand process, particularly your long-term shareholders. They want to understand your processes.
Thank you, Stephen. I will quickly say I think it's important for the board to level up its understanding of tech and make sure there's time in the agenda for forward-looking discussions, including emerging threats and opportunities. So let me thank you all for taking the time to join us today. Our next quarterly webcast will be on Thursday, March 20th from 11 to 12 Eastern. Our topic will be the state of AI through a boardroom lens, and we hope to see you then. Thank you all.